Hi guys. So I decided to do my PD project on creating a training for my paraprofessionals. I teach a third through fifth grade autism classroom, and I have a lot of paras that I have to manage throughout the day, including district paras and non-public agency BIIs. And something that I feel really strongly about that I've been trying to do in my classroom and at my school site is increasing integration with my students so that they are included and a part of general education settings on a consistent basis. And I felt that the paras that I've worked with do not have adequate training on how to support the students in the general education setting, and I've definitely faced a lot of challenges with that. So I decided to create a professional development training for them. And this is what I'm going to be sharing with you. So I'm going to be going through this training just to share it with you, not necessarily as if you were the one receiving it as a para, but the title is How to Better Support Students in Inclusive Settings. Oops. So I felt that it was important to kind of define what an inclusive setting is from the get-go. I think a lot of times people get inclusion and mainstreaming and those things kind of mixed up and don't have a good idea of what inclusion really is. So I felt that it was important to define that from the beginning. So inclusion defined: an inclusive classroom is a general education classroom in which students with and without disabilities learn together. It is essentially the opposite of a special ed classroom where students with disabilities learn with only other students with disabilities. So obviously the focus is on students with disabilities and without being together in the classroom and learning alongside each other. So I felt that it was important to identify kind of like some main points for my paras to take away. And I felt that it was important to focus it on this question: what is the goal for students with moderate to severe disabilities when they are placed in an inclusive setting? I think a lot of times we kind of throw our paras out into gen ed and to support our students, and they don't really understand what the goal is. They don't have the adequate training as we do to really understand what the goal is for our students. So that's where this training comes in. So the first goal that I wanted to touch on is about social emotional learning. So I included this visual of this wheel where it kind of defines the main components of social emotional learning, like self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And so my 3 points that I wanted to touch on are the fact that students learn appropriate social skills from peer models. It's pretty clear that a lot of our students with significant needs lack those skills, and so we teach them. But it's not very appropriate when it is simply adults teaching them and there's role playing when they're not actually, have their peers to help teach them those skills, just as typical students would. Secondly, students gain a better understanding of what their role is as a student in a classroom. I think it's pretty clear that the general education classroom and a special education classroom look very different, and so the role of a student changes. So I think it's important to kind of focus on the fact that students can learn from their peers on how to be a student and the role that they carry. Lastly, students are presented with various situations where social emotional skills are required to respond appropriately, therefore kind of creating these teachable moments. So it kind of ties back into this first point of teaching social skills. And we try to teach all these social skills, but if our students aren't presented with the opportunity to use them or practice them, they are going to lose them and they're not going to actually learn them in an organic manner. And so if we present them with those opportunities in the setting where they are used, you can have more moments to teach them. So my second goal that I wanted to touch on is alternate academic expectations. And I think this is a really important one. And I think this is kind of probably the hardest part of integration that many people have a hard time understanding or wrapping their head around, teachers and paras included. And the fact is, when we integrate our students with significant needs, they are going to have these alternate expectations. We are not expecting them to do the same thing as their general education peers. So I focused on these 2 points, being that students are going to be working on modified work that is aligned to the goal of the curriculum. So if they're in a moderate to severe classroom, they are already working on modified work. So we're just bringing that into the gen ed setting. We are modifying the gen ed work so that it fits these students' academic needs and strengths. So the question would be, what is the goal of the gen ed curriculum? So I kind of gave this example that we're focusing on the main idea or the big picture. An example being, let's say a 4th grade class is learning about the gold rush. Students learn all about people involved, the timeline, the geography, etc. There's obviously tons of things that are focused on in let's say a unit on the gold rush. So what would our student with a disability focus on? So students with significant needs, they're going to learn about the gold, but just more simplified. So what was the gold rush? What is gold? Where was it found? And why is it valuable? And I included this embedded skills planning sheet that Professor Elia Mahoney, who I've worked closely with, she created, and she's shared it with me. And this is actually just a snippet of it. It's not the full sheet, but this is kind of these are the important parts that help you kind of get down to what is the goal and what do I need to focus on. So I shared this just so that my parents can get an understanding of what I kind of focus on when I co-plan with my general education teachers, because this is a resource that I use frequently to kind of get these simplified goals down so that I know what to focus on with my students. And so, you including the unit topic, what are the big ideas and the concepts, and then what vocabulary words. So those are just kind of like 3 main components that you can focus on when you are supporting students in the gen ed classroom. So a little side note, I think when we're focusing on alternate academic goals and these social emotional things, a big question is, how will students participate? Obviously, students with significant needs, they vary in the skills that they have or that they don't have. So to traditionally participate as their general ed peers is not going to be the expectation. So students will participate in basically any way that they can that is appropriate. And I included the word appropriate because we know that our students could participate in any way, but it probably won't be appropriate and acceptable to the gen ed teacher. And so if they can't participate as their peers do, which most likely they won't, they can partially participate. So I just listed some examples of partial participation. So like if students were doing a STEM project, the student with significant needs can hold items or assist. And really the focus is more on being a group member, and again, those kind of social skills involved in being an active participant as a group member. Secondly, students doing a group project, which is similar to a STEM project, is that students with significant needs, they can like type or write out information that is being glued onto a poster board. And so the idea is that the skills that our students are focusing on are going to be different than the skills that the gen ed students are focusing on. The gen ed students are most likely focusing on that really core academic content, where they already have those skills to carry out a group project and, write, type, color, print, glue, put things on a poster board, where our students may not have those skills, so we can focus on those skills instead. And lastly, I included an example of kind of like a recreational example, like for students playing on the playground, is if they were playing a game of handball, our students with significant needs, they can participate by just simply serving the ball. We wouldn't expect them to play a whole entire game, because if they lack kind of those motor skills or that coordination, that they could still participate without it being kind of like this stressful situation by simply just serving the ball instead of having to play throughout the whole thing. And lastly, another goal is that everyone benefits. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Students with significant needs, they gain peer supports as opposed to adult supports, which is more age appropriate. Oftentimes our students are strictly getting support from an adult, and that's not really appropriate as they get older. Secondly, typical students gain an understanding of others with different needs. So our typical peers are going to be learning from our students as well. They're going to become more empathetic. They're going to be more understanding. They're going to learn that everybody learns differently, acts differently, communicates differently. In the end, everybody learns from each other. Thirdly is that typical students, they gain leadership skills in supporting their atypical peers. I think it's pretty obvious that if they kind of step up to the plate and become like a buddy or somebody who's close to somebody with a significant need, that they are going to gain those leadership skills, and that's obviously a plus. And lastly, all students benefit from those additional learning supports provided in the classroom for atypical students, such as visual supports or simplified materials. We're not going to obviously have the same expectations for both of these students, but those extra supports that get brought in can be used, and everybody can benefit from having, an extra visual or simplified material to kind of get a better understanding. And lastly, the overall goal for students with significant needs is independence. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't focus on, or they kind of forget, especially our paras. Sometimes they feel their role is to really support them all the time with every little thing. But really, we want our students to become independent. And so if you kind of keep this idea of independence in mind when you are supporting students in the gen ed setting, you can, I think, really kind of get a better grasp of what the goal is and how to support them.